Move back and forth.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the East Mediterranean Business Cultural Alliance's Lebanon Independence Day, Lebanon and its Rich Cultural Heritage panel discussion. My name is Lou Katsos, EMBCA's president, and AHEPA National Hellenic Cultural Commission chairman. And I will co-moderate this panel discussion with Joanne Keratsos Sayad. Joanne is an author, artist, and cultural commentator. She has lived and worked in Beirut, Lebanon for over 30 years and received the Middle East Book Awards honorable mention for co-authoring Lebanon, A to Z, a Middle Eastern Mosaic. Her book, Gotta Love Lebanon, the family guidebook, explores Beirut and beyond with a New York attitude. A fixture at the American University of Beirut Archaeological Museum, she has helped curate cultural programs for youth and wrote a series of articles for the museum's newsletter. A mentor of authors, Joanne was a book editor at Turning Point, a publishing house specializing in books on the Middle Eastern theme. Currently, she's exploring the life lexicon of the Levant through sculpture and ceramics. So welcome, Joanne, and thank you for joining us today. Our distinguished panel today includes author-journalist Carole Dagher, presenting on Lebanese, Greek, and Eastern Orthodox at the forefront of the citizen state. Surscock Palace and Archives owner Roderick Cochrane on cultural resistance to preserve Lebanon's identity. Anne-Marie Affiche, the CEO and director of the General Council of Museums, Ministry of Culture, on the National Museum of Beirut, 100 years of dedication. Author-owner of Maison Tarazi Camille Tarazi on Maison Tarazi, nearly 160 years of challenges. And author, architect, professor, and founder of the Beirut Heritage Initiative, Carole Dagher, on Beirut's heritage preservation and opportunity for the urban development of the city. All are actively involved in making very important and vital contributions to save the heritage of Lebanon and its capital of Beirut, and hence preserving the fabric of the Hellenic Orthodox community, its culture and history throughout the Levant. The panel, besides discussing the anniversary commemoration of Lebanon's independence tomorrow, November 22nd, of the end of the French mandate over Lebanon in 1943 after 23 years of mandate rule, and as well as the 101st anniversary of its liberation from the Ottoman rule, among other things, will be connecting the dots from history and contemporary current context of how the fabric of Beirut is closely tied to the Greek Orthodox community and how this neighborhood is in the heart of Lebanon and is in danger since the devastation due to the August 4th, 2020 massive blast. We will learn about what is being done to safeguard it along with the steps of reconstruction to preserve this patrimony, which is predominantly Greek Orthodox. Last year marked the 100th anniversary of the Lebanese independence from Ottoman rule, when on September 1st of 1920, the French general Henry Gourand stood at the porch of the Beirut Palace, the headquarters of the French Haute Commissaire, while surrounded by local politicians and religious leaders, and declared the state of Greater Lebanon, the precursor to the modern state of Lebanon. This anniversary, as well as the Lebanese Independence Day last year, passed in many ways uncelebrated. In fact, there was barely an appropriate discussion regarding the 100th anniversary commemoration. Instead, by certain accounts, and I read those accounts also in the US, it was just a compilement of commiserating in the newspapers how on the eve of Lebanon's centennial, it was of a failed state, which of course is not correct, as we will learn today. Considering an almost complete currency collapse, protests, political pandemonium set amid a worldwide pandemic and local shutdowns, that year culminated in a crescendo with an apocalyptic Beirut blast that destroyed many sections of Beirut. The hardest hit, of course, were those around the port and the urban crux of Beirut and the heart of the community that we're going to be talking about today. We will not forget nor have forgotten Lebanon's great and rich cultural heritage and why EMBCA has chosen it to be the first in a series of panel discussions on the Hellenic diaspora, Hellenism, nation by nation around the world, and also obviously all our neighbors in the East Mediterranean. With that, I'd like to start the panel discussions that we will have, and then after the panel discussions, we're going to have a general panel discussion. But now I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one. I'll introduce the first two panelists, and then Joanne will introduce the balance. Our first panelist is Carole Dagher, presenting on Lebanese, Greek, and Eastern Orthodox at the forefront of the of the citizen state. Writer and journalist, lawyer by training, Carole is the author of political essays on Lebanon and the Middle East and historical novels revolving around the birth of modern Lebanon, all published in France. Her trilogy, and I'm just going to read you the American version of them, not the French. Her trilogy, which includes the Monastery of the Moon, the Lord of Silk, and the Princess of the Betignolles, as well as some of her later works, including the Secret Testament of Moses, and recently the Invitation of the Medici, have been renowned and accepted as great works, internationally. She has held the position of cultural attaché of the Lebanese embassy in France between 2012 and 2017. She is also a research associate at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, Center for Christian Muslim Understanding from the years 1998 to 2001, where she published Bring Down the Walls, Lebanon's Post-War Challenge. Welcome, Carole, and please, your presentation. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be part of that distinguished panel, among which I like to salute each and every member of it, but most especially my friends, Joanne, thank you, Roderick, Fadlallah, and of course, Anne-Marie Affiche, who are doing a great job preserving Lebanon's cultural and artistic heritage and archaeological, of course, knowing that that is most particularly probably the only thing that is really the image that gives the image of the Lebanon we love and we like. And most of you in this panel have been through hard times, especially after the explosion of the 4th of August on the port of Beirut. And like most particularly to salute Roderick Cochrane, who has endured so much and whose grief is ours, and still standing and fighting to rebuild the Great Palace and Beirut with it. So it is my privilege, especially that I am not a Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, but I'm a Maronite from Mount Lebanon. And as a journalist, a writer, and a researcher, I've worked a lot on interreligious dialogue and Lebanon's diversity. And in that regard, I've had the privilege to know remarkable personalities, among which, of course, not only our friends today, but also spending time discussing with people who have really left their marks on a generation like mine, such as Hassan Touaini, the late editor-in-chief of the daily An-Nahar, Lebanese newspaper, the Bishop of Mount Lebanon, Monsignor George Khodr, the former foreign minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Fouad Boutros. These are major political figures of Lebanon and representatives of its refined culture elite. And in my intervention, that will be marked by their thinking, because I've had a long discussions with each and every one. I'd like to share a few comments about the qualitative contribution of the Lebanese Orthodox community to Lebanon's heritage, political culture, and social fabric. I won't be long. I would like to elaborate on four main characteristics. First of it, and since we are talking about the independence of Lebanon and the 100th year, the centennial of the constitution of the Lebanese state, I will focus on the role and the place of the Orthodox community and in this state and its independence. So the four main characteristics, to my view and all the works and readings and interviews. First one, I would use the word that Hassan Toueni wrote about by defining the Orthodox community. Heirs of an empire, des héritiers d'empire. I'm talking about the Byzantine Empire. Their old and still current name in literature, Rome, refers to the Eastern Roman Empire, or even used to be Melkites, from the name Malak, king in Arabic. That name was used before the schism of the 18th century that gave birth to the Greek Catholic Church. So from being heirs of an empire, of the Byzantine Empire, to becoming citizens of states, not only of one state, but of each and every state where they live and to which they adhere with a national conscience. That concept has been largely developed by Hassan Toueni and by the late bishop also of Mount Lebanon, Monsignor Georges Roderick. Throughout the history of Lebanon, the Orthodox community has had a sense of the state. And in that regard, they tend to fit in that very honorable category named in French, les grands commis de l'État, or great state clerks, if we want to translate it accurately. I prefer civil servants, and in the noble term of it, a very telling word in democracy, to serve the state, and so unusual in Lebanon, unfortunately. Fouad Boutros, for instance, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, had that unique sense of serving not only his country, but the state, the city, in its original Greek meaning, the polis, as the distinguished, of course, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He inscribed himself in the national tradition set by a founder and a pioneer whose name is Charles Malik. He was an academician, a diplomat, a philosopher, and a politician. And he has served as the Lebanese representative to the United Nations. He was the president of the Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations General Assembly. And in that regard, he participated in the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Roosevelt, and René Cassin, the French ambassador to the United Nations. So the 10th of December, 1948, which we celebrate and will celebrate in a few days, has been adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in Paris at the Palais Chaillot. And Charles Malik also participated in the establishment of the Arab League in 1945. So this is a major Orthodox Lebanese figure that has really contributed to the aura, international aura and place and role of Lebanon. Of course, Hassan Toueni, whom I mentioned earlier, has served not only as journalist in Lebanon, but was an ambassador. So he inscribed himself also in this diplomacy, in this tradition of diplomacy set by the Orthodox community. He was an ambassador, and also he has become a political advisor to President Gemayel in the 80s. But as ambassador, he promoted an independent Lebanon and succeeded in 1978 to foster the vote of famous resolution 425. the United Security Council had adopted that resolution in which it called upon Israel to cease immediately its military action and withdraw its forces from Lebanese territory. It has also established the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, the UNIFIL, still prevailing today, and the objective of which was to bring about and confirm withdrawal of Israeli forces, restore international peace and security, and help the Lebanese government restore its effective authority in southern Lebanon. Of course, we have another Orthodox figure with Eli Salem, who also had been an advisor to President Amin Gemayel and also Minister of Foreign Affairs. So the political motto of these brilliant ministers was to contribute to the emergence of a modern, inclusive state and defend its sovereignty. They promoted a certain vision of Lebanon that we still miss today. Second characteristic, I would add to that quality another characteristic of the Orthodox community. It is an urban community, since the majority lives in the cities, as opposed to the Maronites, who are essentially mountaineers and villagers. That makes them all the more open to diversity, dealing easily with Muslim communities, especially the Sunnis, with whom they share a long coexistence in various capitals and ports, such as Tripoli, Saida, and of course, Beirut. The story of Beirut, particularly, is intertwined with the story of the Orthodox families, I would say, Greek and Eastern, both. In early 19th century, Beirut was an Ottoman city of barely 10,000 people, of which the third of population was Orthodox, and Sunnis half of it. Both communities would share the administration of the city and the exploitation of its resources. The official name of Rum would contain ethnic groups like Cypriots or families originally from the island of Rhodes. The Greek were present and active, especially in maritime commerce and trade around the Mediterranean. And very often, their names bear the title of their jobs. I would mention the Hayat family, Sayeh, Tabal, Sabara, Tabas, Zahar. And their diocese, or their archbishop, was the only Christian one based in Beirut. The Maronites had theirs in the mountains, as well as later on the Greek Catholics would. The third point, the third characteristic, I would say, the Orthodox Greek and Eastern, the Orthodox community and figures and political figures of Lebanon had been promoters of a secular state founded on common interests, coexistence, respect of other creeds, faith, and way of living. Their Byzantine heritage has made them cosmopolitan, able to live in a diverse and plural environment. And so, as they are able to bypass the religious or confessional allegiance, their elite has been a strong advocate of Arab nationalism since the 19th century. No wonder that the founder of the Arab nationalist movement, which became later the Ba'ath in Iraq and Syria, was Michel Aflaq, an Orthodox from Damascus. Considering themselves Arab is a way of separating culture from religion, meaning that Islam is not the only reference in the region, but that the Christians of the East speak Arabic too, and share and bear that culture. Former Patriarch of Antioch and the Orient, Ignatius IV Hazim, a brilliant mind whom I had the privilege to interview also, would repeatedly say, "We were here in that land long before Islam. We are Arabs from before." Actually, they played a role, along with the Maronites, in the famous cultural Arabic Renaissance, the Nahda of the late 19th century, and the movement of political emancipation in the last decades of the Ottoman Empire. Read George Antonius, the first historian to have written about that movement. His famous book, The Arab Awakening, that was published in 1938, tells the story of that awakening and somehow incites also that awakening. He was an Orthodox born in Deir el-Amar, in the mountain. That particular way of appropriating the Arabic championship has made them espouse different Arabic causes, and especially the Palestinian one, without restraint. Many Palestinian leaders were Orthodox in the 70s. I would mention Naif Hawatmeh, George Habash, which were leaders of various Palestinian factions. And even Sohar Arafat, the wife of Yasser Arafat, was Orthodox, is Orthodox. This particular trait has often put them at odds, sometimes with the Maronites, considered as a national church, even a nationalist church, and who claimed to be of Phoenician descent as opposed to the Arabic identity. At least part of a Maronite literature in early 20th century has been driven by that ideology of the Phoenician ascent. I remember Bishop George Hodder noting that Maronite priests have the cedar drafted on their stole during Mass. Maronites are mountaineers, as I said, originally from various villages of Mount Lebanon, more entrenched in their villages of which they bear the name very often. And they have struggled to build an independent state, which they finally succeeded in doing so with the support of the French after World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And here we come to our fourth and final point. The Orthodox community and the state of Lebanon since its inception. Ironically, while the Maronites have fought for the creation of the state of Lebanon and sought the support of the French and developed a strong Francophone literature, books and magazines, the French would turn to the Orthodox community and would name Charles de Bass, first president of the Republic under French mandate, right after the Lebanese constitution was adopted under the auspices of French Haut-Commissaire Henri de Jouvenel in 1926. Charles de Bass was Orthodox, he was a lawyer, and he was kept in power till 1934, when he became Speaker of the Parliament. There will be another Orthodox president, Petro Trad, in a transition period during the independence in 1943, before the election of Bshara el-Khouri as the first president of independent Lebanon. Petro Trad was a deputy and Speaker of the Parliament under French mandate. Another key figure of the independence battle was Habib Abu Shahla, who joined the free government of the Druze Emir Majid Arslan in their quest for independence from French mandate. He was vice prime minister of the government of Riyad al-Salah and would become Speaker of the Parliament after the independence in 1946 and 47, and many times minister. It is believed that two major reasons for that choice. The fact that the Orthodox political figures have not developed the kind of personal ambitions and struggles that have really plagued the political Lebanese scene since the foundation of the state. Second, their keen sense of public interest and an ability to conduct the state affairs. Since the independence, they have shown a great ability in being counselors also and advisors to the presidents, but most and foremost in being intermediaries, mediators between communities, building bridges, not walls. Their national allegiance is exemplary. While they consider themselves as Arabs, part of a whole in the Arab region, they are truly immersed in their country and nation and faithful to the end. It may be related to the nature of their religious organization. The Orthodox Church is autocephalous, as they say, autocephale in French, not supranational. There is no Vatican. So the link is local, religious as well as national, even though the patriarch in Eastern Orthodoxy is the patriarch of Antioch, birthplace of Christianity. So this loyalty and this nationalism in a positive way has really been very great support to the birth and to the political life in Lebanon. And I cannot help but remember those who have paid the price lately, like Gibran Twaini, for instance, Samir Asir and others. So really, I'd like to pay tribute to their role politically, but also, like we will listen right now, on the artistic level, cultural level, architectural level. And today, what is left from Lebanon, the best and the most beautiful, relies very much in their hands, as well as other communities together, all together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carole. And to our audience, the terminology room was used, and for us, it's a Ramier, which is the same word, obviously. In terms of the Byzantine Empire, we know that was created, that terminology was created later in the 16th century, and really not accepted until about the 19th century. No whoever existed ever called themselves a person from the Byzantine Empire. But they were Romans, and certainly thank you for that presentation. I wish we had more time to go into some of those angles, which I thought was fascinating, by the way. But again, for the audience, obviously Antioch and the Patriarch of Antioch is one of the original patriarchs, including the Roman Pope, including the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So thank you for all that. Our next presenter will be Roderick Cochrane. He will be presenting on cultural resistance to preserve Lebanon's identity. Roderick is the owner of the Surscock Palace and Archives, and is one of the heirs of a very successful and great Greek Orthodox merchant family established in Beirut since the early 18th century, and who contributed greatly to create Lebanon's cosmopolitan aspect. Roderick is the heir of the illustrious Surscock family, dating back to the Byzantine Empire that we talked about earlier, or the Eastern Roman Empire, scion of aristocracy in the Levant and Europe on his mother's side, and from Sir Desmond Cochrane, his father. He's related to Thomas Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundalk, who participated in the Greek War of Independence, among many other things. Roderick studied at American University of Beirut, and during the harshest days of the Lebanese Civil War, he lived and worked in London. Returning home years afterwards to revive, restore, and rehabilitate the palace and its gardens, he's also dedicated his time to organize and preserve the archives. He founded the successful venue event company that manages the palace and the gardens, Maria Donna Residence, and the Grand Sofar Hotel for hire. All three venues are a testament to Lebanon's prosperous and sophisticated past, even as they stand in ruins. They still actively serve as the most evocative and elegant backdrop for concerts, exhibits, and weddings, and many other things. Since the Beirut EEST, he's been 24/7 dedicated to the mission of the rehabilitation of the palace from the devastating damage due to the port blast, in order to safeguard the heritage and history, which is iconic for the Levant, the Middle East, Lebanon, and the Greek Orthodox heritage. Roderick, along with his wife Mary, have started a fund to transform the palace into a museum and cultural center. Over these years, Roderick discreetly and generously offers many things to charities and Lebanon, and to its many communities, and also his time and pro bono use of the palace and gardens. He mentions it. Roderick is focused on doing everything so that his daughter Ariana inherits a legacy that it is not impossible and a burden to upkeep. A noble gentleman in every deed and word. Roderick.
Thank you so much for having me, Luis, on your panel. My presentation will be much less sophisticated, shall we say, than Carole's, but here we are anyway. So, Lebanon's cultural history is indeed very rich and varied. Lebanon's culture takes roots from the many civilizations that invaded or passed by. Religion is also a very important factor in shaping the culture of Lebanon. The Christians looking towards the West, Rome, and the Muslims looking towards the east, Mecca. Today's Lebanon is composed of 1/3 Christians and 2/3 Muslims. However, because of the diaspora, Christians and Muslims traveling mostly west and with the domination of the Western civilization over the Islamic Eastern civilization in terms of economy, arts, and science, the country on the whole adopted a Western style of life. So that is the situation today in Lebanon. Until very recently, Lebanon was a melting pot of civilization coexisting in harmony, where all sorts of ideas could be discussed freely. It was a refuge for foreign dissidents. More books and newspapers were printed than anywhere else in the Arab world. Arts, galleries, concerts, festivals, you name it, Lebanon has it all. However, since 1973, an insidious cancer-like disease has been slowly spreading. I will name it as sectarianism. The Palestinians first used it to gain the support of the Muslim population for the fight against Israel. Briefly, sectarianism is what fueled the Lebanese civil war. Today, the biggest danger is that Lebanon might fall under the domination of the Shia Hezbollah terrorist militia, financed and supported with arms from the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is very possible, unfortunately, that Hezbollah might totally change Lebanon's cultural identity. This cannot be allowed to happen, mainly because the countries that Iran dominate nowadays, namely Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, are all failed states. Hezbollah culture, with its relentless brainwashing, promotes warmongering and martyrdom, to the extent that some mothers are happy to see their sons die in foreign lands for causes they have nothing to do with, and thus to gain access to a privileged place in heaven. This mode of thinking is anathema to any person with a minimum of education. Today's independence sounds hollow. How can Lebanon consider itself as independent, in brackets, when it is about to be gobbled up by the Islamic Republic of Iran? How can it be independent when the components of its population seeks the assistance of America, Russia, France, and the UK to extricate themselves from their own mess? It's an assistance which, by the way, is nearly never forthcoming. Now is the time to think Lebanon first. Now is the time to think independence and neutrality. In order to achieve that existential goal, many sacrifices are to be made for the sake of a better country and a better future. Young, educated people, as many as possible, must remain in Lebanon. Schools and universities must continue to dispense the excellent education. Those who can afford must discreetly continue spending so that the money may give work to others and percolate down the lower levels of the population. Lebanon is not a country that has risen from the sands overnight. It has, amongst others, a fine architectural tradition to preserve. This is why, against all odds, my family and I are determined to fully restore our severely damaged palace and turn it into a private museum and cultural hub. This act of faith in the future will give work to countless of artisans, stonemasons, plasterers, painters, cabinet makers, just to name a few. Once open to the public, it will display eclectic collections of carpets from Iran, 17th century Italian paintings, and furniture from France and Syria. The cultural hub will have for effect to draw more people to view international temporary exhibitions, for dance companies to come along, concerts and theatrical representations. Now, I would like to mention also an essential part of this package, shall we say, of that museum, and that is our archives. We have now, we'll talk freely, in fact. Now we do have an extensive collection of archives. And the reason why this collection of archives exists in our home is because they were always situated in that home. So our archives date back from 1860. And what happened is that the people who collected the archives rather the descendants of the people who first collected the archives had the good sense not to throw them away. So the unity of the place made it possible to keep all those archives. I mean, if the palace had been destroyed a long time ago, maybe those archives would have been dispersed everywhere in the world, but this is not the case, or lost. So the people who are living in the palace are very interesting people. So the palace was built by my great-grandfather, Moussa Surscock. We have his archives. We have the archives of his son, Alfred Surscock, who, by the way, was acted as for many years as second and first secretary in the Ottoman embassy in Paris because of his culture and because of the fact he spoke perfect Arabic, perfect French, and maybe Turkish, I'm not quite sure. So he was the embodiment of somebody being cosmopolitan, shall we say. So I was saying that people, the descendants of those people who kept the archives were good enough to keep them. So when people died, or some people died, they just threw everything in shall we say, in jute bags, and those bags were stored for many, many years in very unsatisfactory conditions in the attics or in humid places. During the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, I started looking at those archives and trying to put them into order somehow. But unfortunately, I had to leave the country for a while, and the task was continued by my mother, who had the good sense to send those archives to Kaslik, to the University of Saint-Esprit in Kaslik, where they were all digitalized, and they were kept there for a while. And now they've come back, in fact, they had come back to the palace. And I was working at them to try and sort them out in a fashion that we could locate them fairly easily. And this was being done. Unfortunately, the blast stopped the whole process. And the archives, the next day, in fact, after the blast, the person responsible of the archives at the University of Kaslik calls me up and say, "I hope your archives are all right." I said, "I think they're all right. Can I send them back to you?" He said, "Absolutely, send them back to me." So the archives are back in the University of Kaslik. And in the meantime, I will hope to restore the facilities, shall we say, in the palace for the archives for anybody to come and visit them and study them. Already, many researchers have come along to research them. Books have been published behind our archives. Many theses have been done by students also on our archives. And archives are very important because they reflect the society at the time. Shall we say that, yes, for instance, at the time of my grandfathers, we knew that there was lots of information about shall we say, the famine in Lebanon, the construction of the hippodrome, the racecourse track in Beirut, the construction of the French embassy now, which is the Résidence des Pins. So many, many interesting details. And what is even most fascinating and most interesting, and in a sense, is that, for instance, if somebody wants to make a research on hotels in the middle of in the end of the 19th century, they kept all the invoices of the hotels beautifully inlaid with the rate of the room and what they spent and what they consumed. So it really all makes it fascinating on a smaller level, shall we say, than political level. So this is, I think, all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Roderick, thank you so much for that. It was fascinating discussion. The archives are in what language, Roderick?
The archives are mostly in French because our culture was mostly Francophile. A lot in Arabic, and some in Turkish. The Turkish ones are very difficult for us to decipher, but apparently there are many, many archives relating to the family and relating to Lebanon, of course, in Istanbul. So for anybody interested in the history of Lebanon, shall we say, detailed history of Lebanon during the Ottoman times, their place to go to is Istanbul, definitely.
Are the Turkish archives in the Arabic script like they were during the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
There are scholars, obviously, who can translate those, and that's a separate discussion, but we could discuss that. I'm really fascinated by this, and thank you so much for all the great things you're doing. After listening to this, I can't wait to see the archives myself. To be quite frank with you, I'm going to turn. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn over now the balance of the introductions to my co-moderator, Joanne Sayad. Joanne, it's all yours.
Hi, thanks, Lou. I'd like to introduce this. First, I'd like to make a comment on the hippodrome that Roderick mentioned. That's the photo that you have where they're pre-signing the, Carole, correct me if I'm wrong, the mandate or their meeting to make for the independence of Lebanon. And they're meeting on the hippodrome, on the staircase of the hippodrome, which is not the hippodrome, the Résidence des Pins. The Résidence des Pins.
The Résidence des Pins, yes.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
Great. Okay, I'd like to introduce now Anne-Marie Affiche. Anne-Marie was like most Lebanon, she went abroad and she studied in France. And she went to the Grande École of the Louvre, and then she went and she has a master's degree from Aix-en-Provence in archaeology and history. And from 1994, she joined the Ministry of Culture in the Directorate of Antiquities. And she was also the CEO and General Director of the Council of Museums. She has played a major role in the rehabilitation program of the National Museum of Beirut, reconstructing for the damages from the Civil War. And she's been a curator of the museum since 2009, heading the activities including education, research, management, and the protection of the cultural heritage. She has published many papers and has traveled to conferences around the world presenting the cultural heritage and the finds from Lebanon. And she has been awarded the Chevalier des Arts and Letters from France, as well as from the Italian government, the Officer of the Order of Stardom. And she's been doing wonderful things for the museum, and she also has her research has even led to finding some archaeology that during the war was taken out of the country. And through her work, research, and efforts, she brought attention to this, and she worked on bringing it back to Lebanon. And that's a very happy and good story. So I give the floor over to Anne-Marie for her presentation.
Thank you, Joanne. It is my pleasure to be here today and to participate in this panel at the occasion of the Lebanese Independence Day. I would like to extend my deepest thanks to Mr. Lou Katsos for his kind invitation, as well as to the organizers of this online panel, and especially to you, the moderator, Joanne. Thank you so much. My contribution today will shed light on the National Museum of Beirut. Although the museum was built in the 30s of last century, I thought it would be interesting to underline the idea of building a national museum that emerged actually in the 1920s. The aim was then to enhance the national identity, the sense of national belonging, hence contributing to the social cohesion through archaeological masterpieces discovered in Lebanon. This explains the title of my short presentation today, 100 Years of Dedication for a National Museum. Since its creation, the National Museum encountered many stories. The story of its birth between the 20s and the 30s of the last century, then of its development between the 40s and 70s, followed by its destruction during the Civil War between 1975 and 1991, and finally, its reconstruction and reopening in the 2000 years. These stories are, of course, connected to people, persons who dedicated their careers, their lives, for the preservation of the Lebanese cultural heritage. Those who have conceived, designed, and then created this den of culture, those who enhance its collection by displaying the archaeological treasures of Lebanon, thus outlining the civilization that shaped its rich history, those who, at the risk of their lives, knew how to protect the cultural artifacts wherever they were exposed or kept in the storages of the National Museum during the dark years of the Civil War, and recently those who bravely contributed to the museum rebirth, hence positioning it on the International Museum chessboard and at the core of the Lebanese pride. Each and every one has contributed through different means since 100 years at stimulating the National Museum's life. So a short description of the National Museum of Beirut. It was built between 1930 and 1937, and the first collection of antiquities was displayed to express the history of Lebanon, actually. The creation of the National Museum was then a political decision initiated by a group of intellectuals, translating a prevalent agreement and driven by a strong nationalistic feeling. The aim was to create, and I quote, an appropriate asylum, safe and stable, in order to display the archaeological finds collected. So archaeologists, historians revealed the meaning of these objects so they can perform a narrative within the exhibition at the time when Lebanon was still under the French mandate. The Emir Maurice Chehab, who was the then curator, he managed to put out our museum in the 50s and until the 70s on one of the highest pedestals in the Middle East. He voiced his thoughts in 1937, and I quote him, "Although our museum exhibits only the national antiquities found on the Lebanese soil, the diversity and the wealth of the civilization that lived in this area grant our collections a remarkable interest." So what is the collection about? I'm going to share the screen to show you some pictures of our museum. Here. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. And now? Can you see it?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Okay. So let's try again. Share screen. Sorry. Is that right? That's better.
You got it.
Thank you. Here we go. So this is the National Museum between 1930 and 1937 and its construction, not far actually from the hippodrome we were talking about. Here's the museum in 1960 and the interior of its ground floor. So a short description of this, of the National Museum and the collection. So what is the collection about? It consists of archaeological objects discovered exclusively in Lebanon, like stonework, sarcophagi, statues, altars, and mosaics. There are, all these big pieces are distributed in the vast ground floor hall. Here you can see it. And then the wide gallery on the first floor displayed and includes 70 showcases displaying smaller artifacts such as statuettes, vessels, glasses, jewelry, arranged in chronological order. The basement floor is dedicated to the funerary art in Lebanon. And the theme evokes the rites, rituals, values, and customs that have characterized the Lebanese people in its various regions throughout its long history, from prehistory times to and until the 19th century. So one of the most spectacular artifacts I would like to show you is this one. It's displayed in the basement floor, and it's the series of anthropoid sarcophagi, so-called because a human figure is depicted on each of them. They are dated to the 6th, 4th centuries BC, and it's important to note that they are made of white marble imported from Paros Island in Greece. This is an example of how people were connected in the past and how Phoenicians had developed commercial as well as cultural relations with Greece. The influence of Greek art is very obvious, actually, and very well attested in a great number of artifacts of our collection. So, how these objects were protected during the Civil War? Again, Maurice Shihab played a major role in the preservation of the archaeological collection during these sad years. The museum stood then on the demarcation line, dividing Beirut into two parts, east and west. This is the reason why it was so badly destroyed. Here is a picture of the destruction that happened to the museum. But the exhibited objects that were on display in the galleries or in the storage rooms were safeguarded by Emir Maurice Shihab and his wife Olga. The small and easily movable objects had been stored in the basement rooms, and all the exits were perfectly sealed. As for the large objects that could not be moved, they were protected by concrete cases. Here is an example of the concrete case that protected actually the whole large stone collection of the ground floor of the museum. These two procedures of putting away the items or objects behind concrete walls saved the national treasures from barbaric acts. At the end of the war, the damage was critical, both to the building and to the collections. In the early 1990s, prospects for a better future were foreseen for the museum. High expectations were set despite its massive destruction. And at the time, the Ministry of Culture, supported by the National Heritage Foundation, headed by the then First Lady, Mrs. Mona Harawi, began the restoration of the buildings and of the collection. All the energies and goodwills contributed to the museum's rebirth. The archaeological excavation expansion brought out over the years a better understanding of Lebanon's past and enriched the National Museum with newly exhumed objects, which unfold various stories. In the past 20 years, we were able to open new galleries and to restore artifacts thanks to the civil society involvement and to the donors' contributions. The most recent example is the reopening of the National Museum basement in October 2016, after being closed for more than 40 years. This project was achieved thanks to the generosity of the Italian government. Here's a picture of the basement floor. So despite all dedication and energy displayed to keep an institution like the National Museum alive, a catastrophe like the 4th of August 2020 double explosion is a tragedy. On that terrible day that killed more than 200 people, injured about 7,500, while leaving about 300,000 people homeless, the National Museum was miraculously spared. Aside from shattered glass doors and windows, shattered elevators, torn signage lying on the floor, the collection on display was there, standing and intact. The bronze statuette depicting Aphrodite, Venus, illustrates this tragedy. It has tilted because of the blast and the explosions, but still it's still here in the showcase. And we have compared it to the reed that bends but does not break. Because Lebanon, as you know, is facing terrible moment today, existential moment with the recent economic, financial, social collapse. Moreover, during the last 2 years, the cultural sector and the museums, all museums in Lebanon actually, have been drastically affected by the COVID-19 sanitary crisis. And the National Museum had to close its doors for long months. So today, I would say to conclude that our greatest challenge is undoubtedly to do our best in order to preserve our national heritage, our national cultural legacy, which is definitely a Mediterranean and a universal common heritage. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, you did great. Like a generation of Lebanese who suffered from the civil war and who went abroad and got the expertise and then had faith and came back to help restore and rebuild. It's quite amazing, and it's an amazing challenge to see the museum so beautifully done today. And I know though it's suffering, and thank you for all that you continue to contribute.
Thank you. This is the least we could do, actually.
Next, we have Camille. Is Camille here? Does anybody have any questions for Anne-Marie? Any questions for Anne-Marie? Anne-Marie, I'd like to just ask you about one story about during the war, when there were some things taken out, illicitly plundered. Can you just tell us, that's a very interesting story. Can you just mention that, what happened?
Yes. Actually, a lot of very few artifacts were stolen from the National Museum. Most of the collection that disappeared during the Civil War was taken from storerooms in different sites, And in 1981, we had, unfortunately, a big loss with a lot of objects stolen from Byblos site, archaeological site. And it's a few years ago, actually in 2017, 2018, that we started this restitution process, because we discovered some of these items that have been stolen in the 80s. Some of these items were we discovered in different areas and different countries outside Lebanon. So it is a very happy ending story of restitution, and we had the chance to have again in Lebanon a few objects actually, but we have to still work on trying to restitute and to get back the stolen objects that left illicitly the country.
Thank you. Thanks. Anybody have any questions for? Okay, great. Okay, Camille Tarazi. Well, where do I start? Camille studied architecture by formation. He's an architect and he has an MBA. He is the 5th generation to continue running Maison Tarazi, a veritable institution throughout the whole Middle East since 1862 for the production of the Oriental art, furniture, and objects. The palaces throughout the region have the fine, intricate ceilings, and he has continued and is running the business and continuing this artmanship. And in 2015, he published a beautiful book, The Vitrine d'Orient, which it reconstitutes in images and text the 150 years of the history of Maison Tarazi, along with a collection of postcards from the turn of the 20th century. And he also is a co-author in another publication from the Arab Arab Image Institute, where he has some important photos and research that he might like to tell us about. And he travels and gives conferences and exhibits around the world. So Cami, I leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and it's a pleasure to see you, all of you, even I'm not so far from you. And it's a pleasure to talk about my family business, and I will display one PDF so it will be easier to explain the whole story. I don't know how we can use it. Oops, optimize. I don't know if you can see it. It's easy. You can see it.
Yes, we got it.
Okay. Actually, the family business, I started I was doing my architecture in university, and Fadlallah was one of my teacher, and thanks to him that I was more passionate in history and research. And meanwhile, I was doing this family business. I discovered my family in a way that I should do some research just for fun, and it became a passion, and then it became a mission. And I will talk very quickly about how the family evolved. And actually, the origin of the family is from Urfa in the south of Turkey, and we were my ancestor Mekadish left there and went to Damascus, and then after the third and the fourth generation, they escaped from Damascus after the killing of in Damascus. They went to Beirut, and some of members went to Athens. So the family scattered away, and so some members of the family went to Athens and they came back. One of them was André Terzis, who joined to his brother Dimitri in Beirut, who had already a family business, and he called it the Musée Oriental. So after 26 years of collaboration, they divide the shop in two. So we had Dimitri Tarazi and Sons and André Terzis and Sons. And Dimitri, who is the grandfather of my grandfather, started to do the business alone with his sons. And they opened shops in Jerusalem, then in Damascus, then in Cairo and Alexandria between 1862 till 1925. And André opened a shop in Beirut, then in Jerusalem, and then the new generation opened in New York a few years later in the 30s. Actually, the family business started in a way that it was the fashion of Orientalism from Europe, and a lot of people, tourists, used to come to Lebanon, Syria to visit the Holy Land. And so they started to adopt a kind of furniture that you can see and have been produced by different manufacturers in the world, in Syria especially. And the Tarazi used to buy from this manufacturer and to do some furniture for their own and for especially for their clients around the world who used to pass the different shops. And some of the furniture had the name of Tarazi on it, and it's a way to give a kind of signature of the good quality and everything. And during my research, I discovered that some furniture were bought by the Harvard Semitic Museum in 1902, and all the bills are still preserved there, and even the items that they bought at that time. So I will talk about the other part of the Dimitri Tarazi and Son, which was involved in decoration and customized furniture for, let's say, for the Ottoman Empire. They did the throne just for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Sultan Abdul Hamid reign, and it was a command from Lebanon for this occasion. And in 2011, I found it by chance during my research, and it's still displayed at the Yildiz Museum in Istanbul. And the Tarazi were involved also in the decoration of the Villa Linda and Michel Sursault in Beirut, where they have done all the furniture and the decoration of the ceilings. But even we don't have any proof that there were the people who did the work, but I have the proof that my great-grand uncle used to use this book of P.M.Athens, where he take all the drawings for the ceilings of the Linda Sursault Palace. And also he have created this triple arch vitrail, which had been vanished in 2020 after the Beirut explosion. And a few years later, they did the famous brass door of Alfred Surscock, Cochrane now palace, which have been damaged in 2020 as well. But we talk about it later on. And then just after that, they did all the woodwork for Alfred Surscock, who was a manager of the Sec du Parc, which became later on Résidence des Pins, where the 1st September of 1920, they did the declaration in front of the main gate done by the Tarazi, and you have Gouraud and all the Lebanese authorities around him. And a few years later, they did all the woodwork for the houses or in the different floors, as well for the Karame Palace in the same Oriental style, which is still preserved, both of them. And all this work have been done by the family till 1926. From that period, the bankrupt started, and my grandfather and his brother Alfred started from zero to work in Morocco, where they started to work in the shop of their uncle from their mother's side, and whose name Khouri Haddad, and who was associated with Hayek family. And in 1931, they opened the first shop in Rabat, and then in 1936 in Damascus, and then in 1946 in Beirut, and here in 1954, they opened the first gallery in the Saint George Bay, where they built after that the Al-Tadar Hotel, and where they display all the woodwork and the family business in the contemporary way. And also they used to have their own shop in the ground floor. From that time, they started to do all kinds of decoration for Hotel Bristol or Casino du Liban, or even Hotel Byblos. This is the only main Hotel Byblos in Saint-Tropez. This Oriental room still exists in Saint-Tropez, so at least they preserve this work. And also the Henri Pharaon in Beirut, they did some woodwork and some restoration, and here we can see the vitrail below the below picture, which have been restored in 1976 during the Civil War. Henri Pharaon has to do the new model of the vitrail, which have been done for second time at that period. And all this woodwork is still preserved thanks to Museum Awad, which is now closed. And some other private villas used to have Oriental customized Oriental rooms. So in 1976, the war started, and the hotel became a big and huge atelier, workshop, and we have done all the work under the bombs for different places as the Ministry of Interiors or private villas in Abu Dhabi, and as well the woodwork for Rassan and Nadia Toueni. This was the request of Nadia Toueni to have a ceiling before she passed away in 1983, I think so. So from that period in 1988, my father started to do the family, to continue the family business with his father, Emile, because Alfred and Emile stopped to work together in 1987. And from zero, my father started to open his own workshop in Brumana and his and showroom in Brumana. And in 1996, it was the revival of the Résidence des Pins, where at this period, I discovered the legacy and the heritage of my family, that I tried to understand how it began and how I became more curious about this. And during that period, my father started to do all the woodwork in collaboration with Jacques and Alfred Mata Entreprise and Jean-Marc Pivot Architect, and also Catherine Gemeux from the decoration of the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. So I was involved with all these people, and I start to understand that the family business, I have a duty or a mission to continue this heritage that my ancestor did, and as well my father. And so now you see how the Ottoman Résidence des Pins have been completely destroyed, and then my father did a new one based on new plan and technical integration of element in the ceiling, even on the wall. And then we did and collaborate, my father and I, for different projects in Europe, as well in Lebanon, and in different style, following different requests of the architect and decorator and client. So with all this work is thanks to also the architects who are involved in creating all the Oriental decoration, even it could be contemporary or completely modern. And as well in 2015, we did the restoration of the woodwork of the Nicolas Surscock Museum as well. And it was a great experience because we have to do a kind of little restoration without changing anything. And in 2015, I did the book Vitrine de l'Orient, which talk about all this history that I have been researching during 20 years. But behind the scene, we have to think and to thank all the team that I'm working with since 20 years, and since many generations through my father, my grandfather. And you have different skills or different techniques or different way of heritage in the traditional way, which is painting on wood for doing ceiling, wall paneling for the Oriental rooms, or musharabiye with the handmade handwork with all kind of furniture, as well mother of pearl inlay for different kind of furniture. It could be floral or geometric design, even engraved wood and marquetry of wood. And all these traditional are preserved through the different projects that we do and create for the clients. Even the copper and brass for doing lantern, for doing small items, or different type of lantern with integration of the glasses. Sometimes we have also the blown glass that we used to work with in Damascus, especially, and we do have also in Sarafand. And all these kind of techniques are still involved in doing all kind of work that we are asking for them. And suddenly, in the 4th of August 2020, the nightmare started, and I never imagined that I could witness something like this. Even we have witnessed all the civil war and everything, but this was much more Hiroshima bomb that destroyed all hope and all everything. But the most difficult thing during this destruction, of course, is the soul and the people who lost their lives and their homes and a lot of things. It was heritage that was completely vanished, especially the one that I was most attached. It was the one of the triple arch vitrail of the Linda Surscock that I wasn't, who survived the civil war and everything. And when I saw all this damage, I saw that a part of my family was completely vanished or destroyed, and I had the rage. So that's why I came to this house first, and I tried to sort and classify all the elements in a way to preserve what can be so preserved. But I did all the drawing for this, and the story stopped in this step. But in the meantime, I was also shocked and completely sad about what happened in the Surscock Palace, Surscock Cochrane Palace, which was completely in the eye of the hurricane, where everything had been destroyed. And when I saw this main brass door completely on the floor, I was completely enraged, and I want to put it back. And I start to do the classification, to take all the nails from the floor, to keep it aside. And thanks to Mon Liban d'Azur, who I know, and they asked me to do something if I need to do something for preserving the heritage. So directly I think about this door, and we started in April 2021, and you can see the different steps by removing the nails, trying to see all the elements of the door which should be restored, and to give some reinforcement of the wood door leaf with some steel inside the wood. And then when we remove all the carved brass, I discovered that a lot of varnish from different period of time had been stick on it. So I decided to give a cleaning and brushing so that all the drawings and the detail were more visible. And so that's how we started to do this work. And as soon we tried the door there on site, we put back all the brass and the nails, and then we put back the door on site. And it was something that a kind of revenge, a kind of resurrection that I wish to do just for the memory of the family, and especially the memory of Surscock family, and for the memory of Alfred Surscock and his daughter Yvonne, and for the new generation, especially Roderick and Mary and Ariana. And it's important for me to to give this hope, and especially in the country where everything is completely dark. And the weird thing that Roderick and I were looking at each other, and we were saying that probably our ancestors have done the same position or same pose to see the door in 1916, how it had in 1915, how it would be put in for the first time in the palace, and now a few years later we put it back in a proper way. But in the meantime, around the Surscock quarter, you have also the Diocese of Beirut, which have been completely destroyed, and I found probably all this furniture that we restored in 2012 as a gift for this archdiocese, and it was two furniture that have been done in 1908, which have been completely destroyed. But luckily, because we have done the restoration of these pieces, so we have all the documentation and the pictures so that we can do the restoration. But because they are not in a hurry, so we keep it aside and we sort all the elements and we classify everything. In the meantime, facing to the archdiocese, we have also the Nicolas Surscock Museum, which was something completely catastrophic, because when we did the restoration in 2013 to 2015, we were completely taking care about all the stained glasses, all the vitrage that shouldn't be broken, and we should keep whatever we can keep. But thanks also to this restoration, we have a lot of documentation, And you can see how the Salon Arab windows have been completely destroyed except the structure. And we added all the wood, new wood, because it was impossible to put all the pieces back, as well for those windows, which was completely delicate. And in collaboration with Maya Husseini, we have put back all the color glasses for these windows. And the only thing that we have done in the restoration was this door of the Surscock Museum. It was a kind of puzzle and a maze, so we have to put back all these pieces, as well for the Liza restaurant. Everything have been vanished, so we tried to do all of the woodwork in the proper way, in the traditional way. And thanks to my team and the people who are involved in this kind of traditional work. And also we have witnessed it with furniture, which was completely dramatic mess, because when you see all pieces in small on the floor, we have to gather everything. And this is what I did with all the people that I know, that they have to gather all the pieces, and whatever happened, we can reuse them and we can put everything back, but at least we should have all the pieces collected. And this is what we have done for this type of furniture, or this kind of chest. Even missing pieces, we were challenging to put back a new one so that nobody can see the difference. What I want to say is very weird that my father witnessed the Civil War, and he put back the main gate of the French embassy in 1996. And I never thought that myself also I will put back the brass door of the Surscock Cochrane Palace on site after the explosion of Beirut. And both doors have been done for the Surscock family, and both doors done by the Tarazi, and both doors have the same fate and revival. So this is what we hope for Lebanon, to have a revival of maturity, or being more involved for the future as a nation, not as different countries involving their nose in this small, tiny place. I hope I didn't speak too much, and voila. Stop sharing, okay. So voila, and I hope everything was sufficient and clear for you, because it was not easy to talk about the history of the Maison Tarazi, the tradition that we are trying to keep, whatever happens, and all this challenge that we had to do in Beirut after this explosion, especially when you have a lot of demand at the same time, and you have a lot of people who want to save their heritage in a way, but sometimes we try to let them know that we have to slow and to take the right way to do the restoration, as I learned from also Fadlallah, who give us the instruction how to do everything. So I keep Fadlallah to continue the panel of discussion. Thank you, everyone, and I hope everything was clear.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Camille. Does anybody have any questions for Camille?
It's moving and it's impressive.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll go over to Fadlallah now. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Fadlallah, who actually has been an inspiration to as a professor. But Fadlallah is an architect and a member of the Order of Engineers, and he is a professor as well, who has influenced a generation of architects and students coming out of graduating here at Alba. He founded Dagher, Hanna and Partners Architects, which is a multidisciplinary architectural firm that builds from skyscrapers to public projects to, he's particularly known for specializing in heritage buildings. He's actually one of the country's top experts in restoration of heritage buildings and conservation. And he has collaborated with the Ministry of Culture and has run surveys and has been in charge of extensive surveys with APSA, the Association for the Protection of Ancient Demurs. And his particular fields of interest is Islamic culture and architecture with a focus on Near East and Middle East. He has many publications. He is really, I can say, a Renaissance man because he's an illustrator. He's done a book on the history of Lebanon from Larousse. He is, let's say, he's did publications on the beautiful old houses he's documented that he's restored. And he sees the poetry in the architecture. From the titles alone, one title is Le Chant de la Terre, the Song of the Earth, is one of the titles of his books. And so he is a true Renaissance man, and he has civic duty. He is dedicated. When this happened, this blast, he got together, and what did he do? He put on his cap, rolled up his sleeves, started an initiative, a Beirut Heritage Initiative, gathered everyone together, and helped in the rebuilding to safeguard the heritage. Now, and I also want to say he is really brilliant student. I met one of the directors of the school of the university who chose him to restore his home when he was just a first graduate. So he is spectacular, and I'll give it over to you, Fadlallah.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. Well, I'm really I'm honored, and you're really too kind with me. I want to congratulate all my colleagues and friends who gave talks tonight. All of them, whom really I'm really very close to everyone, each and everyone, and each and everyone is doing a great job in preserving Lebanon's culture and history. My introduction tonight will be on mainly on the urban fabric of Beirut. I have to say that yes, the blast was a catastrophe. The Beirut blast on August 4, 2020 was a catastrophe for Beirut. But Beirut was put in danger very, very early on in the 1950s, when the early master plan of Beirut was established. And this master plan really opened way to the destruction of the heritage and destruction of the social fabric of the city. And after the blast, we initiated the Beirut Heritage Initiative, as you were saying, Joanne, yes, to preserve Beirut's heritage, but mainly the main goal of this initiative was really to preserve more than the heritage, the urban fabric and the social fabric, because people who has been living in these neighborhoods for more than 150 years, today, 15 months after the blast, most of them are still out of their homes. And that is the real catastrophe, because Beirut has witnessed, as you know, 15 years of civil war between 1975 and 1990. And during this period, the whole center of the city was emptied from its inhabitants. And today it stands reconstructed, maybe, but as a ghost city. And the main challenge today is really to try and avoid having the neighborhoods that were hit by the blast becoming another ghost city, becoming empty of the social fabric and the inhabitants. And this is what we really are struggling, working on, trying to build back the neighborhoods, the clusters of old buildings, heritage buildings, as well as other buildings that are being worked by other NGOs working on the ground. So there's a real, the civil society organizations are really very active on the ground and have been very active since August 4 to try and bring back this city to life. I will launch my presentation. So I will share my screen. And just let me know if you see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will, of course, what we are, our mission at the Beirut Heritage Initiative is to work on heritage buildings, heritage homes that were destroyed by the blast or affected by the blast. But mainly our goal is to bring back, as I was saying, the social fabric, the people who were living in those homes, the people who were working there, bring them back and really help them back into the city, because otherwise the city will really have no interest at all. But as I was saying, Beirut was not really destroyed only by the war or by the blast. As you can see in this picture, which is a recent picture of Beirut and the neighborhood of Dawar, Hermel, and Ashrafiyeh, Beirut is really an urban mess. It's an urban mess because today the development rights are the rule that sets the whole economy of the city. And the big problem we're facing really is that up until today, the master plan of 1954, which was a modernist master plan that really took no provisions on preserving the heritage or preserving the social fabric. It's still, this master plan is still what is being worked on today in Beirut without any revision, despite 30 years of fight to try and revise it. And when we look back at old photos of Beirut, I'm talking old, it's 100 years old, this photo that you see here of the Saint Andrew Bay in Beirut, which is the Dawar neighborhood. As you can see, all the buildings have some sort of family look-alike. They all have the same volume, which is a cubical volume, topped with a pyramid red tile roof and 3 arches on the facade. And all the buildings are parallel to each other. Of course, the scales are a little bit different because the scale varies according to the social status of the family. However, all these buildings, from the smallest to the biggest, have really the same typology of architecture, which is specifically what is called the Beiruti house. And I will elaborate a little bit on what is the Beiruti house. In this picture, you can see on the top of the hill, the Surscock Cochrane Palace that Camille showed in detail, and Roderick talked of it, of course, in detail as well. And we can see that the neighborhood was really 100 years ago quite homogeneous, and of course, it had a very strong Mediterranean feeling. Another picture of another neighborhood. Sorry. It's a little bit slow. Okay. Another neighborhood shows the same characteristics. We saw that all the buildings are practically built on a grid of parallel lines. All the buildings are facing north with the 3 arches, which is the large opening on the view, large opening to the sea, and large opening also where the sunlight does not come into the houses. So these houses were also built in a way to capture in the best way the prevailing winds in order to have natural ventilation, and capture the light also in the best way with these large openings on the north, avoiding the sunlight. But this Beiruti house, actually, it started emerging around 1840. around 1840, the area around the center of Beirut, which was the historical city, were all agricultural fields planted with mulberry trees mainly. And from the mulberry tree, of course, the silk was cultivated, silk was extracted and sent to France and brought back as silk fabrics through the port of Beirut. And so these neighborhoods in the suburbs of Beirut, of the city, historical city, these houses were made of 3 rooms, with the central one facing a large arch, which is called a Niwan. So this is the central Niwan type, which is a vernacular module, which was found actually in the suburbs of Beirut, but also in the mountain. And little by little, these small houses, which were very symmetrical and centralized, started to be enlarged because the needs, of course, of this agricultural population, the needs started getting more and more important, and the family also started getting wealthier. And the families of Beirut, instead of living inside the city, which started to be overcrowded, they fled from this overcrowded city, the historical center, and they went to the suburbs, which was practically a garden and agricultural fields, and they started living in those villas. So the small vernacular houses were little by little enlarged into villas with a central courtyard and rooms on the side. And by 1860, with, of course, again, the enlargement of the Beirut port, the opening of the road to Damascus, Beirut really at that time started being the gate to the east, and the commerciant, the merchants of Beirut, the bourgeoisie of Beirut, erected this new type of house that we will call the Beiruti house, where this modular building that we saw evolving from the vernacular small house in one type to a central courtyard house started. The central courtyard was closed. The opening to the north was adorned with 3 arches. Why 3? Because it was the style of a sort of classical style that came through from Italy, through Constantinople, Istanbul, Constantinople to Beirut. So these 3 arches adorning the north facade, and the central courtyard was closed also from the top. There, a ceiling was put on it, and an upper floor was added. So this process was a process of extension, where many of these early houses in the suburbs of Beirut were extended little by little in order to get around 1860 this typical type of what we call the Beiruti house. So this Beiruti house was built in local stone, sandstone, which was extracted from the hills of Musait Bey, west of Beirut. And the timber for the ceilings and the floors was imported from Turkey. It was Lebanese cedar, but from the Turkey forests, because the Lebanese cedar in Lebanon was not available for construction. The forests were really too little at the time, so it was not permitted to cut those trees, but it came through the port of Beirut from Turkey at the time, and it is called Kotrani, which I was told is a Greek word for this cedar. I don't know if it's true, but this is what I was told. And the top of the buildings was covered with red pitched tile roof, which came from Marseille, also imported from Marseille. The interior of those buildings were all done in Italian marble, mostly, and terracotta from Marseille as well. So it's a mix between local materials for the walls and imported materials for the slabs, the beams, of course, all the woodworks, and the tiling, etc., was imported. So this house is really a cosmopolitan house, we can say, because it's, of course, starting from a vernacular local type, it evolved into a Mediterranean house that very much resembles the Venetian homes that we see on the Grand Canal in Venice. So these houses, as I was saying, mainly all look the same, with a cubic shape, and the north facade with 3 arches. The 3 arches on 2 floors and sometimes 3 floors. And by 1880, this type of architecture was practically fixed and started being erected from the start as this type, while before that, houses evolved little by little into what would become the Beiruti house. Now, why am I insisting on this Beiruti house? Because it's interesting to see how this type of architecture that emerged in Beirut around 1860 and between 1860 and 1900, then spread all along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean to, of course, other cities of Lebanon like Tripoli and Sidon, but also south to Palestine, reaching Alexandria, and north in northern Syria, and then to Turkey as well. Even in Mersin, this type of houses can be seen, and everywhere it is called the Beiruti house. So this Beiruti house, extending to the mountains of Lebanon also, was later on named the Lebanese house. And why am I insisting? I'm insisting because this Beiruti house, Lebanese house, has not yet been recognized by the authorities in Lebanon as natural or national heritage. Although it is called Beiruti house in the whole area, in the Eastern Mediterranean area, although it is called the Lebanese house also on a larger scale, yet it is not protected by law up until today. Now, this type of house is built on a typical plan, which is a central hall plan, where you can see at the bottom of this plan, of this drawing, you can see the 3 rooms and the Liwan, extending to the north with a central hall and rooms on the side, and the kitchen, which was a vaulted room added later on. And all the houses are really built on exactly the same plan. That is quite interesting and very characteristic. So we can see houses with different scales, from the smallest to the largest, that all follow the same typology. I'm sorry, it's a little bit slow when I try to change. Here you can see, for instance, many buildings, many plans, and specifically in all those plans, you can see that there is a central hall, always directed north-south, so the north is to the top. From the smallest, so the Remail 115, to the largest, Remail 358, which is the Surscock Palace, you can see that they're always the same typology. Of course, more elaborate when the building is larger, because then there would be a specific professional architect, while the smaller houses were built only by stonemasons. But these stonemasons had learned the style from, of course, the corporation. And as I was saying, this house evolved from really a very small module. Later on, it became this large central hall house. And the typical plan was used in Lebanon from 1860 up until the 1950s even. We can find some buildings in the 1950s in a modern style, but still with the central hall system as a plan. Now, what I see really interesting in this pattern is that, as I was saying, the scale of those buildings vary according to the wealth of the family or according to the social status or the needs. And from the little house to the much larger palace, the typology is always the same. As you can see, the north facade systematically shows those 3 arches in the center of the facade facing north. So this is the typical architecture of Beirut. And the concept of what is the Beiruti heritage, of course, relies a lot on these buildings, but also on later building, more recent buildings from the 1920s, 1930s up until the 1960s, where we can identify also the modernist heritage of Beirut that is also worth of interest. However, all of these buildings that I'm showing you, this type of architecture from 1860 up until the late 1960s is not protected neither by the master plan of Beirut nor by the regulations. And many activists, including Roderick's mother, the late Lady Cochrane, fought a lot, battled a lot to safeguard this heritage. But up until today, we have not succeeded. Now, the reason for my intervention today is to say that following the blast, actually, there was a real reaction from the civil society, because we were used to see those houses disappearing little by little, those buildings being destroyed little by little. And even though we were not happy with it, it was not a very shocking process, such as what happened on the 4th of August, where most of this heritage was violently damaged by the blast. And most of the houses, really some of the houses were demolished. I will show you some images later on. And most of the houses were severely affected. So this, as a reaction, the civil society operated on the ground to try and safeguard this heritage. Now, the Ministry of Culture is trying today, with the help of UNESCO, with the help of course, all the civil society organization, trying to identify and put the basis for the protection of these neighborhoods. However, these neighborhoods cannot be protected unless there is a real new master plan for Beirut. The master plan that was elaborated in 1954 shows extensive development rights in the historical neighborhoods. Actually, as you can see on the map, the darker the color, the bigger, the higher the development rights. So in the center of the city, which is the historical city, and in the suburbs of this historical city, which is really the pericentral neighborhoods, there is a very high density. We can build sometimes up to 10 times the area of the land. And this very high density, of course, economically ends up in having a real struggle for those the heritage buildings, because they cannot sustain economically the fight if they are not protected by any legal framework or any legal procedure. And as a consequence of this very dense building rights, as you can see, we have here a historical building dating from the late 19th century, surrounded by recent buildings, more recent, not very much recent, but more recent buildings that were built under the 1954 master plan. And as you can see, the building is practically dwarfed by the neighbors. And this situation is getting more and more difficult, as you can see in those images. The image to the left shows you one building surrounded by high-rise towers. And this is practically the situation today in Beirut, where developers, which are connected to the political mafia and the banking mafia, all together, they are trying to increase regularly the development rights, getting higher and higher. And of course, all of this is being done without any real urban vision, and the city is really in a mess. And as a consequence, the picture to the right shows you how historical all buildings are being demolished as a consequence, because for economical reason, it doesn't make sense to keep those buildings for the owners. And this is what Beirut looks like, a real, very dense city of buildings rising up from all sides. And if you look really closely, you will see that there are some smaller, lower buildings that are those heritage buildings that we are trying to save. Now, you would say, why would we save those buildings in such an urban mess? And this is where I would really want to stress out that there are clusters of heritage buildings that are still existing today in Beirut. Clusters surrounded by, of course, higher buildings, surrounded by this urban chaos. However, these clusters still show what Beirut would have looked like 100 years ago with gardens. It was a garden city at the time, a garden city where the buildings were surrounded by gardens, and all these gardens have disappeared, and there's a lot of density, as you can see. The Beirut blast on August 4, 2020 practically affected mostly the heritage houses of Beirut. As you can see in the pictures, those houses built out of stone and timber were really very much damaged. And the neighborhoods that were affected were the neighborhoods around the port of Beirut, the port that has been really the vector for the prosperity of Beirut between 1830 and 1970. This port practically, with the explosion, affected all the neighborhoods that developed around the port during this century. So what do we do today with this catastrophe? The idea, apart from, of course, restoring house by house or cluster by cluster, the idea is really to push for a new vision, a new urban framework for the city. The idea is not to come up with a top-down plan as if we were building a new city. Actually, Beirut is a very interesting city because of its complexity, because of these mix and match of buildings, because there is some sort of urban chaos. However, there is life. It's a very lively city. And the idea today is really to use whatever is the character of this city, the contrast between those old neighborhoods and the new neighborhoods, and the blast effect and whatever it produced, to try today and implement a new vision for the city, where this new vision, of course, would be to create urban relations, pedestrian relations, vehicular relations, and green promenades along the city to connect the neighborhoods that are really today acting as ghettos. There is no relation between the neighborhoods. Each neighborhood is closed on itself. And the idea is really the neighborhoods that were hit by the blast were the neighborhoods, the most lively neighborhoods of the city. And the idea is today to spread the culture of this openness, of this freedom, of the culture that was the cultural industries that were booming in this area, to spread into the whole city. I am sorry because I have a problem. As you can see, I'm in the dark. I am out of power. This is Lebanon, Beirut tonight. And so I want to stress out, because before ending my small speech, on those blasted areas where there is an opportunity today with a very old urban highway that was planned and was not executed, the Fuad Boutros highway, to turn it into a Fuad Boutros green park instead of having a highway, because today it wouldn't improve at all the circulation in the city. And this green park would connect the center of Ashrafiyeh to the port of Beirut, where the blast occurred. So the areas that were really hit by this blast would all be connected by a green park that would be open to the public in a city where really the green spaces are really very little and not implemented at all by the municipality. So the idea today is really to bring back the culture of life through green spaces, urban connections for pedestrians, for bicycles, less cars, public transportation as much as possible, and again, creating more connections between the neighborhoods to start taking the center of the city that is a ghetto today, an empty ghetto and a ghost town, make it live again in connection with the rest. Et là, j'ai été coupé.
Fadlallah was cut. He said he was cut. He just said he was cut.
He was cut power-wise or what?
Power-wise, he was cut power-wise.
Well, I got to tell you, this has been a fascinating discussion, and everyone here is to be congratulated on what they're doing to preserve the Lebanese culture and heritage. And it's amazing. It's good actually that Fadlallah was at the end, because he was talking about a new urban vision. Obviously, you can look at Athens, for example, and what took place with Athens. Athens, in the past was one of the most beautiful cities in the Mediterranean. Their style was not, of course, the Beirut style. It was a neoclassical style. But what was interesting is the same thing that Fadlallah was talking about in terms of the developers and the deals and the ability for them to demolish all these things completely changes the character of a city. So now you see Athens is really a mismatch of different building heights and all the rest of that, and that neoclassical beautiful aspect that represented old Athens has disappeared. So all of you are to be congratulated for trying to preserve what's there. I did have some questions for Fadlallah, because most people don't know, including my audience, by the way, that I also was a professor of architecture. In my case, at Cooper Union in New York. And I just wanted to mention the fact that I am in New York. I am involved in one of the buildings that was demolished during 9/11. And that was the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church that's currently being rebuilt. And, and on a pro bono basis, I'm also working to attempt to build it with Santiago Calatrava, who's the architect of that building. But what's fascinating about what I'm mentioning, downtown New York and where 9/11 took place, is that particular area in New York was called Little Syria. Most people in New York don't even know this, but it was called Little Syria because that was the area in lower Manhattan on the west side where a lot of the Syrian immigrants started to come in from the mountain areas that you were talking about, Maronites, but also the Orthodox. And they started coming in about 1880s. And I would say, I could be wrong, and anyone correct me here, but I would say there are more Lebanese outside of Lebanon than there are Lebanese in Lebanon. Am I wrong on that or no? Anyone?
Carole, yes, it's true. It's true. There are more Lebanese than, yes, that's true. If Carole wants to say something.
No, unfortunately, yes, indeed.
And I'd like to ask a question, if I can, of Camille, with regards to the workmanship and what's taking place. And fortunately, you had some of the designs when they were doing restorations and all the rest of that. In terms of labor, how are you finding the labor to actually duplicate some of these things that were created many years ago? Can you unmute, Camille? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, about the labor, it's complicated because a lot of them are leaving the countries because of the economical situation. It could be from Lebanese people or Syrian people who are living in Syria. And it's quite a tragedy because we don't have a school of heritage like we have in France with the Louvre, or they learn people to do and to try to understand how to manage the traditional artwork. It could be from carpentry, from masonry, from anything. And we always manage to find people that used to work to these people who travel outside Lebanon or leave Lebanon. And it's a kind of what we call it, everything like when you are Titanic and everything is sinking. So you are trying to preserve what you can find and to give them more, what we call it, ability to work for different projects, for different things. And we really need to have a school of architecture, of preservation of traditional arts and architecture, of building back the traditional houses. And I know that Fadlo is involved in this kind of awakening people about all what we have to do. And for the traditional art, it's complicated because you have a lot of talent who are leaving the country because they find more better work from, they forget the traditional work and they do something else elsewhere. And since the war in Syria, a lot of people left Syria as well, Lebanon, because they were living between Syria and Lebanon. And most of them are between France or Germany, and now somebody of my team is living to Canada. So we are trying to hope that nobody will leave completely, and so that we can keep heritage and we keep all the traditional skills in Lebanon or in Syria as well. And that's why I'm trying to do a lot of conferences in Europe through my book and learning people about, especially European people, that we still have heritage that we can give a life and to preserve it through different projects, through different restoration. And they are more aware about what we have in our countries than maybe the Lebanese. Instead, they don't know what to preserve and what to do. But thanks to Fadlo and the Beirut Heritage Initiative, that they try to make people aware about the skills that are flowing apart. And voila, I don't know if I answered.
Thank you so much. Fadlallah, two questions for you. Number one, why three arches? I'm just curious. The three arches keep sticking into my mind. And the second question is, what is your thought process against reversing some of what you considered let's say the mafia, the development mafia, which is not a mafia, by the way, that's to Beirut. I think it's a mafia to everywhere. Certainly, I come from a place where the mafia exists in terms of, high-rise buildings. I'm involved in them myself in the construction business. But the three arches, and also, what do you feel has to be done with regards to development and awakening the people, let's say, that they have to preserve their heritage?
Okay. First of all, please let me excuse myself because I ran out of power because there's a problem in electricity. So now I'm just on candlelight, but I'm back in the panel. Louis, first of all, I will answer the second question about the mafia. When I talked about the mafia, I didn't say the developer's mafia. A developer is a developer, and they try to use every legal and economical way to do the best they can do in their business. However, most of the time, of course, they need to rely on political influence. And in Lebanon, the problem we're facing in Lebanon is that we have a political mafia, which is really very much connected as well to the bankers on one side and to the development sector on another side. And all these people interconnected together really block any reform in terms of urban planning for the city. So the good news, let's look at the bright side. The good news is that since 2019 and what we have called the revolution, some sort of revolution, this political class has lost a lot of its power. Of course, it still holds the street today. It holds all the official posts and the ministries. However, the population and the civil society has taken a lot of influence back. And today, what is being done is really to try and more put pressure on these people and put pressure on the political system in order really to get somewhere in terms of planning, because this is essential. How are we going to do this planning? As I was saying, the idea is really to strengthen the relations inside the city that were really not taken care of before. So pedestrian connections, green connections, urban transportation, public transportation, which is not existent today in Beirut, 30 years after the war. And as you can see, 30 years after the end of the war, we're still without electricity. As you can see, I am a living proof of that now. Also, what we need to do in order to fight whatever is happening, I think the developers, whenever there is a master plan and there is a law and there is a very strict regulation, the developers will work by these regulations. Today, most of these buildings that were developed in Beirut in the last 30 years, most of these buildings are empty. If you look at Beirut by night, you will see that most of the buildings are empty. Practically 10% of the apartments are inhabited and the rest is empty. Why? Because a lot has been affected by the blast and people are living out of the city, in the suburbs or in the mountains. Of course, many people have fled the country and are living outside of Lebanon. Yet, there is a lot of construction which does not represent the needs of the local population. And this construction has been promoted by the ultra-liberal political system in Lebanon. And practically, this has created very big divisions in the social fabric of the country. We have people that are really living a very hard life today, not only because of the economical crisis, but because they have been also neglected by the central government and pushed out of their traditional neighborhoods. The city of Beirut, as I was saying, the center of the city that was reconstructed after the war, has been reconstructed not for the population of Lebanon. It's the center of our capital, of Beirut, and it is empty of the Lebanese population. It has been meant and designed for the expatriate population, for people from the Arab world that would come in. And really, it is a scandal because the center of the city, the center of the capital of Lebanon today does not belong to the Lebanese people. And this is what is really a catastrophe. So the plan is today to work little by little on each and every area, identifying the problems and trying to break the walls, trying to break the ghettos that are being erected. Why I focus a lot on the neighborhoods of Mar Mikhail and Gemmayzeh that were destroyed by the blast, because these neighborhoods were the most open in Beirut. These were the neighborhoods where really the spirit of the capital was still alive, with a mixed population. When I say mixed, it mixed on the social scale and of course also on the sectarian scale. And the population that was there mainly was a population living on small enterprises, on education a lot, the health sector as well, many hospitals in the neighborhoods, and mainly the cultural industries that all moved to these neighborhoods. Cultural industries and tourism, because a lot of restaurants, a lot of pubs were developed in this area. So it was an area that was alive 24 hours a day, really all day long, all night long, not the same population during the day and the night, because people, of course, are not the same. The people who work at day are not the same that spend the night there. However, it was alive with all the social classes and all the ages of the population of Lebanon. It was really a very interesting area. And this has been practically killed by this blast. So there's a big question today. Will we be able to get back this activity, this enthusiasm, this energy? It's a big question. We are working on that. The Beirut Heritage Initiative is one of the CSOs that is working on that, along with many others. There is a plan today that is backed by the UN, the EU, and the World Bank, which is called the 3RF, Reform, Recovery, and Reconstruction Framework for Lebanon. It was launched after the blast in last December, a year ago. And today, this plan is very slow in terms of implementation. However, it puts around the table the international community, the Lebanese government, and the civil society organizations. So 3 entities who are working together and talking together in order to implement a new vision for the city and a new vision for Lebanon, practically, under of course, the reforms that have to be implemented. And one of the reforms is this urban development reform that is really essential for the future of the city. Otherwise, it will keep on getting more ghettoed, and the inhabitants will be kicked out of the neighborhoods for what we don't know, for a major social change in the city and maybe in the region. We have to say here that Beirut is, along other cities in the Near East, one of the cities that were affected by war. Let's all look at what's happening in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, all these cities that are thousands of years old, with a civilization that is really thousands of years old, being distracted. And Beirut is the last of those cities that has been affected also by this terrible blast 15 years after, 30 years after the war, practically. So it's a big challenge for all of us. We don't have, of course, all the powers in our hand to try to reverse the system. However, we're fighting as much as we can. Now, getting back to your first question about the 3 arches, why 3 arches? There is no clear explanation of that, because we have no writings from the builders of that time who explained. As I was saying,
maybe Roderick in his archives, we can find them. You know, you never know. You never know, because Roderick, you mentioned that your archives start around 1860 or so, I believe, and we would be fascinated if you can find that. You have some paperwork relating to different hotels, etc. Maybe you can find that. I'd love to find that out.
That'd be very interesting if we could eventually find something effectively. I will be starting looking for it. But my explanation for the 3 arches would be, as we are all Greek Orthodox amongst ourselves, mostly here this evening, we would consider this as being the Trinity, maybe.
That's what I was thinking, by the way, but I didn't want to say it. But forgetting about what we think, I think Roderick, I think your records will actually. I'm willing to bet if you go into it, you're going to find this out. And this, by the way, would be monumental, because as was indicated earlier, this is the style that, quite frankly, is a heritage style that maybe hasn't been recognized as such. But this could be an extremely important thing that came out of this conversation, besides the fact that all of you are doing a fantastic job preserving the heritage of Lebanon. Roderick, when can we expect the museum and the archives to be opened, in our minds?
Well, it all depends really on the political situation and the state of the country, and of course the finances to rebuild the palace. If everything goes normally, I would expect about 4 to 5 years, at least that will be the time, more or less, for the reconstruction to take place in normal times, I say.
Very good. Anne-Marie, you showed us some aspects of the exhibits in the museum that were, fantastic. In terms of the work that you showed with those particular sarcophagi that you mentioned, the anthropoid sarcophagi, the period that you're talking about, I mean, the artistic aspect of those sarcophagi was in my opinion, quite unique.
Yes, I wish I had more time, and maybe some other time I will be talking about in detail about all these artifacts. And especially, I just wanted to point out to this particular series that has a very strong connection with Greece. And it's very interesting to see the artifacts in the museum that have been influenced by Greek art, sometimes 2 centuries before the arrival of Alexander in the region. So it means that the connections and the commercial and the cultural relation that used to be there was there much before the arrival of Alexander and the beginning of Hellenism.
Well, we're talking about two societies that are mercantile societies, as you know. Okay, the Lebanese, of course, and the Hellenic. Obviously, the Hellenic alphabet, was influenced by the Phoenician alphabet. There's no doubt about it. Certainly, there was trade back and forth, and quite frankly, our people have probably known each other longer than most people know each other. And it's just absolutely fantastic when we think about also, just as a group, our Eastern Mediterranean cultures, okay, how we in fact have so much interlinked with each other, in particular because of certain empires that lasted a few hundred years, okay, whether it's the, let's say the successor, dynasties post Alexander, or even if it's the Ottoman Empire that in fact merged all of our cultures together. And the terminology of room that we talked about earlier, okay, that was indicated earlier. The Romi were multicultural people, okay. And when Roderick talks about the cosmopolitan aspects of his family and our cultures of what we're talking about, these were cosmopolitan aspects of our cultures, and there was a linkage back and forth with multi-languages being spoken by all of us. Yes.
Even more, we think we are very much connected today. Actually, I think we used to be very much more connected in the past. And as you are saying, with the commercial relation, but also in the culture. And it's amazing how you see things that are quite similar in terms of development between our countries and all the Near Eastern Mediterranean cities, with all the same development since prehistoric time, and then the Bronze Age, so the second millennium, the first millennium, the expansion of Phoenician with all the colonies in the Mediterranean basin. So it's quite similar as a development of all.
Well, it's more than similar. I think what happened is, as we had national movements develop, national movements within various countries, a lot of these similarities, people started to discount them, that people were different and they were not in fact like each other. And what's obvious, and I feel great that we're starting these series of where we start to talk to people in different countries, and we start to see the similarities of their culturally, historically, and all the rest of that. And again, Roderick's family goes back to the Byzantine, time period that, and Constantinople, Alexandria, Beirut, all these areas, including Marseille, that was discussed earlier, is where some of this artistic work was coming from. All these particular ports, including Smyrna, which was destroyed about 100 years ago in terms of the burning of Smyrna. All these people, all these cultures knew each other a lot better than we know each other today. There's no doubt about it in my mind. So I find this discussion very fascinating. Everyone has been, obviously, to Lebanon, because you're all from Lebanon. I haven't been, but after listening to all this, and I think many people in my audience who are listening to this feel that they have to go to Lebanon to see some of their culture, not only your culture, but our culture, our combined culture. Carole, I'd like to just discuss what we talked about before in terms of the Byzantines, the Maronites, Orthodox, etc. I mean, don't forget that all the people there were one and the same. And obviously, if it wasn't for the Crusades, it would have been a little bit different on the Maronite Orthodox scenario. But I found the conversation is interesting. What do you think is, Carole, in terms of going forward, in terms of all these different groups, religious groups? Are we all going to finally realize that we're similar We know each other. We've been there for 100 years, etc. What's your thought, Carole? Is Carole with us?
I think
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I think she lost connection. I had previously lost connection, so she's not on the screen.
Okay, okay. So these are all fascinating discussions. Joanne, I'm sorry for asking too many questions. Do you have any questions of the group here before we call it a day? As a matter of fact, I'd like to do this again, actually, because sometimes when we start conversations, there's so much to talk about that there's never enough time to discuss it.
I just want to thank them all and thank them for their contributions, their dedication, their excellence, and their scholarship. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you for preserving, what I'd like to say is our cultural heritage, And all of you are to be commended for the fantastic and fine work that you are doing within Beirut to preserve that particular identity and the culture. Thank you for being with us today. And thank you to the audience for being with us in this first in a series of nation by nation of EMBCA going into different countries and having discussions with people who really know what's going on in their countries. Thank you again, and good evening to all of us. Good evening to you in particular in various parts of the world that you're in, whether Roderick in Rome or I think Camille in Monaco or you in Lebanon. I mean, it's just amazing. Thank you again, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
very much
guys.
for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you again. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.